From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome my good friend, Congressman Darrell Issa. I actually should say Chairman Darrell Issa to the show. Darrell serves as the representative for the 49th District in California. That includes Camp Pendleton, the largest Marine Corps training facility in the United States, along with portions of San Diego County and Orange County. He's chair of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee and also serves on the House Judiciary Committee. And are you still on leave from E&C, the Energy and Commerce Committee as well?
I am, at least until I finish my chairmanship, which I'll stay where I am as long as possible. Overseeing government is fertile ground for good work.
Well, believe me, we want to keep you there as long as you're willing to stay. And I usually try and start these things out with something a little personal, and I mean this in all sincerity. You're one of the guys in Congress I really admire. I mean, you grew up in modest circumstances, went off to the Army, served the country with considerable distinction, came back, made yourself an extraordinarily successful business person. You're one of the people that certainly doesn't have to be in Congress. Very, very successful financially. Got involved back in California, helping on state questions, building the Republican Party, eventually running for office yourself. And in your case, actually more than most. I mean, think of guys like you and Vern Buchanan, our colleague from Florida. You really serve because you love to serve. I mean, you could be doing literally anything else. Now, your spouses, why Kathy and Sandy let the two of you do this, I'll never know. They're probably the people that we ought to really thank. But,
it's hardest on the spouses, it really is.
But your career has been remarkable. And in the House, you've just been such a difference maker as a member legislatively across the board, now as a chairman. So I want to start out with the big question, two questions, actually a personal one. Then what got you into this? Because again, you had so many options after your business career, and still do whenever you want to pursue them, and yet you chose this.
You know, there's always a spark, and my spark was one that people of Oklahoma might remember. When Bill Clinton came into office, we just had a huge tax increase under George Herbert Walker Bush. But that tax increase was, he said, out of need to balance the budget. Bill Clinton came in and he started talking about the greed of the 80s. My wife and I had left California with a 67 Karmann Ghia, and 2 months before our child was born, and we're driving across country, very pregnant. No money, started a business, 1980. So I took very personally that it's one thing to say we've lived an American dream and now government has a money problem. I'll live with that statement. But to say that the greed of the 80s was anything other than hardworking people finding success under Ronald Reagan bothered me. And that's what got me into politics, leading eventually to my running for office.
Well, I tell you what, thank God for Ronald Reagan, and thank God that you felt the need to do it. Tell us, you know, most of our viewers won't know a lot. They'll know a little bit about the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, partly because James Lankford has served on that committee. But this really is the premier oversight agency of the United States Congress in terms of real congressional action. So give me an idea, or give our viewers and listeners an idea of the scope of what you do and some of the things you're working on right now.
Well, you know, when I recruited Congressman Lankford, I did so by explaining to him, as somebody who had run a camp that had over 50,000 attendees a year, and I said, here's a place where organizational skills are essential because it's about all of government. We have jurisdiction over every aspect of government, including the entire federal workforce. But we're about where the waste, fraud, and abuse is, where the inefficiencies are, the duplications. And I said to James, I said, if you come, you can help me because you understand what the right way to run an organization is. And he agreed to come, and he's been great as a subcommittee chairman. Eventually he'll be chairman if he chooses to. But that's our jurisdiction. We don't own a lot of legislation. We don't pass a lot of laws out of our committee. What we do is we find the waste, and then we have the authority to reorganize government out of our committee to prevent waste and duplication.
Well, and you made him a subcommittee chairman as a freshman, which is an extraordinary thing.
He's an extraordinary member.
He is an extraordinary member, but you're an exceptional chairman to see that. And I told somebody, boy, that's like putting the keys in the hands of your 16-year-old and saying, go at it.
Well, he's run a lot of 16-year-olds and younger. You know, when I announced my chairman that first year, I basically said, you know, here's James Lankford. You may not know him well, but he's been able to organize over 50,000 children a year to do the same thing and do it well. Now, if he can do that for the 435 members of Congress, there's no limit to how far he can go. But he really is a superb organizer, and he gets to the facts. He's been working on a lot of the oil and natural gas issues and a lot of the benefits that will come to Oklahoma by being able to export liquefied natural gas, take advantage of our abundance. And boy, I'll tell you, you talk about somebody who that wasn't technically the part of Oklahoma he came from, but he gets it. He really does.
Yeah, no, he masters any subject he's in. Let me ask you this, probably the most famous single incident during your chairmanship or episode that you guys really focused on was the so-called Fast and Furious. And I'm going to use the word scandal because I think it was scandalous in terms of what the administration did and how uncooperative they were with your committee in getting to the root of it. So sort of give us your understanding now, the dimensions of the scandal itself or the incident itself, whatever words you choose to use, and where we're at.
Well, starting at close to the beginning, ATF agents down there by the border in Arizona had repeatedly tried to essentially let guns walk and sort of follow them. And they had a loose idea of how to do it. They found a sympathetic U.S. attorney. They did not find a sympathetic U.S. attorney under President Bush. He shut it down. But under President Obama, they found a new U.S. attorney that would let them run this program called Fast and Furious. And it was a terrible idea. 2,000 weapons walked into the hands of the cartels, and eventually 2 of them were found at the scene of the murder of Brian Terry. And that sort of created the event that everyone knows about. The real challenge, though, is when you do something stupid and you recognize how stupid it is, don't compound it by lying about it. What happened was on February 4th, 2011, Congress was lied to. Senator Grassley of Iowa and more expandedly later the rest of Congress was told that they never let guns walk, when in fact all the documents show they knew they were walking guns. They may have had their idea of what it would do successfully. Turns out it wouldn't, but the real problem was the lie. And then after the lie came the cover-up. Until today, we're still in federal court after a contempt of Congress resolution. We're still in federal court trying to get the courts to order the administration to turn over the documents about the lies and cover-up.
You know, we focus, and I think appropriately, on our government putting guns into the hands of criminal cartels and drug lords and the death of an American agent. I happened to be in Mexico on one of our congressional trips and met with the President of Mexico and high Mexican officials, and they look at this and were aghast because they've had, I think the estimates have been as high as maybe 200 of their citizens killed by these weapons that we provided. And you know, they were asking, how could you do this? And what would you think of us if the Mexican government armed you know, criminal cartels inside your country that were killing people? I mean, wouldn't you be pretty upset that you did something like that, let alone that it was done with no consultation and cooperation with us? You know, you're just, you know, interjecting this deliberately on our side of the border. Have you, did your committee get any reaction from the Mexican government or that side of the scandal?
That's been exactly the outrage. Trusting the United States in this war against illicit drugs, they ask us for one thing: stop the guns from going south. We ask them for one thing: help us interdict the drugs coming north. That bargain was broken in this situation. They tell us when they know that drugs may be crossing. We hid those guns crossing south. And that was probably the greatest challenge, is that if we had told them what we were doing and they went along with this structurally failed program, they'd have nothing to complain about. But it was just the opposite. We actually created computer systems that even when the ATF agents, our own agents in Mexico City, punched in the number of a weapon found, it came up erroneously not Fast and Furious. So there was a concerted conspiracy to prevent anyone, even our own people in the embassy in Mexico City, from being able to help the Mexican government understand where these weapons were coming from.
Have there been any consequences to the individual? I know you're obviously still in court on contempt, but any actions been taken for any of the officials responsible for dreaming this thing up and implementing it?
Effectively, no. Dennis Burke, who was the U.S. attorney very much at the center of it, has resigned. He now has a consulting firm and is taking in good money, I suspect by now, from Homeland Security. He simply flipped over and has a bunch of partners, and he's now in the security business, which is sort of ironic.
That's ironic.
But other than his resignation, pretty much everybody else simply has left in the ordinary course of a new administration coming in, the change between first term and second term. And they've gone pretty far to try to brutalize our whistleblowers. One of the things our committee does, and does constantly, is protect whistleblowers. You didn't ask, but I'll bring it up. Benghazi. We're continuing to investigate Benghazi.
We were headed there, but good.
And this is the same situation. Only through whistleblowers are we able to find out what the real facts on the ground were, the real understanding of what they knew, what they thought, and how erroneous this idea that it might have come from a video was. And then the cover-up. Days and even a week later, people still saying on Sunday shows, Ambassador Rice saying that it was somehow the video, when in fact people on the ground had said just the opposite. And that's the challenge we face, is how do we keep from being deceived again? But more importantly, and many of the people in Oklahoma have served overseas, how do we protect the men and women who go to these countries on our behalf so they know the next time something like Benghazi happens, and it will, that it won't be just good luck and some survive and some don't?
Well, there's so many incidents, that Benghazi incident, that are disturbing, and one of the ones that bothers me, just from an investigatory standpoint, I know we had FBI people on the ground supposedly investigating. They were pretty slow to get there. After they had supposedly secured the site, we saw instances where news media coming in after them literally were finding some of the ambassador's papers, journals, those kind of things. And if there's a real investigation going on, how in the world would that material not have been secured at the time the FBI was there?
Well, it's a great question, Tom. I'll give you a different perspective a little bit. As awful as that was, as inept as the FBI was, the days they waited for permission to go to a murder scene on U.S. soil, which is what an embassy is, as much as that's part of our investigation.
Consulate, but still U.S. soil.
Yeah, and the annex,
yeah.
Both of which were our assets. But here's the point that I think the people of Oklahoma would want to know. This was a terrorist attack. It is not a crime scene. The idea of going to there is to say, what terrorist organization did it, where are they, and how do we keep them from ever doing this again? That wasn't the way they did this. They were looking for, can we find fingerprints? No. You've got an al-Qaeda-linked organization. We know who they are. Many of them are still there in Libya. That's what it's all about. This is just another example of the war on terror has gotten worse, not better. And if you start treating terrorism like common crime, then you bring in forensics thinking they're going to apprehend a suspect. This is not about who killed Ambassador Stevens. This is about the organization that plotted a September 11th attack, the first one in all these years since September 11th, 2001, and it was done effectively on U.S. soil again.
Yeah, well, and frankly, with more than ample warning in terms of the ambassador himself, and multiple warnings on ground that this was a dangerous situation, with our good ally and friend, the British, having closed their diplomatic facilities in Benghazi and gotten out. I mean, I think it borders on criminal incompetence at the minimum, that these folks are out there in a position that were that exposed.
Well, Ambassador Stevens wrote his own epitaph in an email to the administration on September 11th, the same day that he was killed in the evening. He sent an email that says it's not a question of when or if, but when we will be attacked here. He was trying to make clear that all the plans to show Benghazi and Tripoli off as successes and peaceful were clearly not only overstated, but just wrong direction, that things were deteriorating. And that's not what Secretary Clinton wanted to have said. and it never got to the public.
Well, are there any other, I'm going to ask you some other areas, but any other particular investigations your committee is involved in right now you think would really be interesting to folks?
Well, sometimes the little ones are really worth focusing on. First of all, we're doing a lot of work on the duplications, on places where you can save money just by doing the same job in one place instead of 80 places. Okay, and renewable energies happens to be the one, there's 80 places. But my favorite one right now seems small, but I think to people who bid on contracts for anybody, the IRS awarded $500 million in several contracts to an underprivileged zone. They call them hub zones. Except the zone right here in Washington, D.C. was on the campus of Catholic University, where you pay $35,000 to $40,000 per student to send your children. The employees, the only employees we were able to find, were students and an assistant coach of the football team. Again, students whose parents were paying $35,000 a year. They were not on scholarship. They were not poor kids. They were supposedly workers, but they actually never did one bit of work on the actual delivery of this $500 million worth of product. Instead, a very wealthy man living in the Virginia suburbs, a man already had multi-million-dollar homes. In fact, he ordered IBM and other companies to do the work directly, to build directly, and simply send him what we would kindly call a commission, but as the primary contract, he was getting it all at a premium. Probably cost the American people over the life of the contract $15 to $20 million of absolutely greater amount than if they'd simply chosen the non-hub zone individual. And my ranking member, Elijah Cummings, classic Democrat, believes in hub zones, but he also believes that it should have done some benefit for that blighted area and not gone effectively to somebody in a rich suburb.
Well, I tell you, we could spend the entire show talking about your committee, because I think it's honestly one of the more interesting, and it's one of those things that Congress as a whole hasn't done well. Your committee really has, which is really engaged in serious oversight of the federal government, expose these kind of things and try and clean them up. But let me ask you about another area, because actually you are justly famous, I think, in the Congress for being a guy that deals with substantive issues. One of the substantive issues that you know probably more about than anybody around is patent law. And as the holder of 37 patents yourself, I don't think there's anybody in Congress that holds anywhere remotely that. Now that our colleague Roscoe Bartlett is gone, I don't think you have a competitor at all. But you clearly know this process, know the importance of it. So explain to our viewers and listeners a little bit about what are the issues involved in patent reform, where we're at, what are the things that, as a patent holder and an innovator, as well as an entrepreneur yourself, that you think we ought to be worried about and focused on.
One of the challenges we have in patents right now is to make sure that they're so robust, they're so good, they're so accurate as to what the real new invention is, that you can go with a certainty and say, I invented it, read it, and pay me for it. Or you can go to an investor and say, I own this technology, invest in it. Most patents right now are so poorly executed on that if they go to court to be challenged, a great many of them, over 40% of them as a matter of fact, will lose all or part of their validity. And to the inventor, that giving them a patent that doesn't stand the test in court is to their detriment. And of course, to other people making competing products, a loosely written patent is just an invitation for a lawsuit. So that's one of the big lose-lose. It can cost as much as $8 million a side to go through patent litigation. And if the outcome were more certain, people would give that in a royalty instead of a lawyer's bill. So that's one of the challenges we face, is to get patents to be executed quickly but accurately. And right now the accuracy is even more of a problem than the speed. The other area is that we went into this business model patent where people would come up with how you would do something. And it's a new area. And new areas tend to take a long time for the law to get settled. And so a lot of people have patents in that area that are in fact going to be very difficult to make any money on until a body of law is settled. Those are some of the areas. Here's the other one though, Tom. America is an innovating country, and we are a body of innovators. But when it comes to actually applying for patents, more foreigners apply for patents in the U.S. because they recognize we're one of the few places that stands behind our patents. Patents more valuable in the U.S. than any other country in the world. And that's one of the areas where we need to invest in more people in America being involved in this process of innovating. And we need to make sure that when you go overseas with your idea, it isn't ripped off in countries that don't respect intellectual property.
So legislatively, where are we at in the process of achieving some of these goals that you've outlined?
Well, we've got one that's right now going to come into play that I think is important to consumers, and that is we're going to define a new category of patent for the automobile manufacturer. A 2.5-year exclusive period for a manufacturer, Ford, Nissan, whoever, who comes out with a new car, so that those parts are covered for 2.5 years. When we pick that amount, that's enough time for the manufacturer to have exclusivity, but then after that, it becomes an expired patent, which allows the aftermarket to come in and make a fender that, quite frankly, saves you money when you need a repair of your older car. And that's one of the areas of innovation that we think a patent market can both protect the initial manufacturer, but then also recognize that insurance rates are higher if you have to buy parts that are more expensive, and certainly as a consumer, you'd rather have a new manufactured part than not be able to afford on your 5-year-old car or 6-year-old car that new part, but then your only alternative is a salvage part. And the in-between is a well-made but less expensive part. So that's an area of just commerce innovation that right now is starting to build momentum.
Well, again, I think your answer shows why you're so respected, because you're a lot more substantive. And these are not the kind of issues that a lot of, they're on the news or people are focused on, but they're really the guts of governing and protecting the economy and innovating.
Well, making business realize that the government should be with them and thinking about how they do their business and then modeling government after it is a new idea here in Washington.
Shockingly
we're hoping
idea.
It'll catch on.
Well, maybe with you and Vern it might. We need some more examples like you guys. Let me move you to another area, and I think it would surprise, again, the people in my part of the country about your knowledge and your passion for and your success in Native American issues. I have to tell you, I did not expect one of my closest friends in this area to be a Lebanese American.
Different tribe.
Different tribe, but hey, we've decided you're one of us. I mean, these Lebanese, it must be our lost tribes, must be in Lebanon, or maybe we're all descendants of Phoenicians or something. But whatever. You have been a leader on this issue. What caught your interest originally and because I had the opportunity to travel with you in your district and some of the surrounding area a number of years ago to individual tribes in California, and I get to do a fair amount of that as a Native American. And I usually can tell pretty quickly if this is the first time the congressman has come to see the tribe, or these are old friends. And in your case, you knew each of your tribes intimately. You knew their circumstances. You knew their leadership. They clearly knew you and were comfortable with you. How'd you get involved?
Well, I've been fortunate. They've invited me to their weddings. Quite frankly, I think when you take over a new district, you ask, what did your predecessor not do? My predecessor, quite frankly, never went out to visit these tribes. And they represented so much land. And they also represented fire hazard. To be honest, these are areas, and you know how as soon as you hit tribal land, the level of protection you're going to have is very much debatable. And a lot of our tribes were trying to build their own fire departments, things of that sort, infrastructure. And of course, Indian gaming had been a lively topic. So I went out just to visit. And I was surprised that not only had they not seen my predecessor, they hadn't seen a Republican, not a state assemblyman, not a state senator. And so I sat down with them. I knew that the Constitution gave us a specific obligation and responsibility and peer relationship. And I said, look, I'm from the federal government. Let's talk. It's clearly defined that, your issues are your issues. There's treaty issues, there's water issues, there's historic lands issues. And they educated me. And that's been one of the most wonderful parts, is being able to go out and sit under the great oak, which is one of the great sacred sites in my district, and just hear about how it got to be there and what, for as far back as man can tell stories, this area was significant. And over time, they've educated me, but they've also given me great opportunity to realize the mutual benefit we get. The tribes in California, yes, they've enjoyed some prosperity as a result of gaming. They've also passed that prosperity on to tribes that are outside the gaming area that aren't in such good locations. They've reclaimed ancestral lands. They've actually bought land for no purpose other than to preserve land. So that relationship has been very mutually beneficial, and everything I know, I'd have to thank the tribes in California for teaching me.
Well, you've recently played such a critical role. I mean, we passed the Violence Against Women Act, and that's something, honestly, I think people on both sides, normally is a routine reauthorization. Nobody's in favor of domestic violence, and we all know that there's an appropriate role for government to play to try and help people caught in those awful situations. But one of the innovations this year was legislation that began in the Senate that you authored. I was a co-author of an addition to over here, and that was to give tribal governments the ability to have some jurisdiction over sexual assault and domestic abuse cases on their territory. And that's an idea that met with some resistance, I think misplaced resistance, but when you dropped your bill and all of a sudden there was a counterpart to center language over here, and we had enough Republicans like you that had worked with Indians, things began to move. So reflect a little bit on that and the role you played in it.
Well, I was honored to play a role in what should have been common sense. You have governments. They're willing to go through a process to be trained and recognized in being able to deal with violence against women on the reservation, but they're prohibited. Makes no sense. Very small town, right outside a reservation line, might not be very well organized, might not have much, but they'd be able to do it. And you look and say, well, what could possibly be a reason that you wouldn't be able to? And it goes back to a sticky problem. There is sort of a racial prejudice that is underlying. Indians don't live up to the Constitution. They are different. They won't do it. They'll be unfair to the white guy who beats his wife on the reservation, who's an enrolled tribal member. And it took a while to hear some of this. But the more you heard it, the more you realized it's time for a change. It's time to make it very clear that these governments are the governments that were here before we were here. And if they're a hybrid of the best of Native tradition and the Constitution, then we certainly will benefit by having them be bolstered. And bolstered, by the way, at no expense to the people off reservation. And I think ultimately the vote was decisive. And the people who were trying to come up with all kinds of questions about the Constitution, they got swept aside, and swept aside without actually being called racist. But I think we all knew that they had an agenda that wasn't about the facts that we were dealing with.
Well, again, that legislation would not have passed without the role that you played, and I think you're now revered widely in Indian country. You were certainly known before then. We just got a few seconds left, and literally seconds. I want to close with this. I mean, you've had, I think, an extraordinary career in Congress and have really contributed. What do you want to do next? And I mean, hopefully within the context of Congress. I don't want you going someplace else.
Well, I enjoy what I do. I'll do that until the conference says it's time for me to move on. But as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I'm on leave from Energy and Commerce. I'm on leave from Foreign Affairs. I sit on Judiciary. I was once on the Select Intelligence Committee. Lots of things you can do. But there isn't a better job than one I have right now, so I'm enjoying it. And I think the issue that you talked about a minute ago, recognizing the inherent rights, the inherent sovereignty of tribes, and then expanding on those, that's an area we can work on in the days and weeks to come, because there are other areas in which tribes have not been allowed to assert their sovereignty over their lands and their people and those who come on their reservations. And I think we're just in the infancy of getting that to be where it should be.
Well, as a Native American, I'm going to stop the show on that point, because that's where I want it to end. Hey, Darrell, thanks a lot.
Thank
it's
you,
an
Tom.
honor to have you here.
Real pleasure.
You bet, my pleasure. Great job. You're